The customs hall at New York's JFK International Airport hummed with a unique kind of organized chaos, a symphony of rolling luggage wheels, distant boarding calls, and the low murmur of a dozen languages blending into one. The air was sterile, thick with the scent of industrial cleaner and the palpable anxiety of travel. Under the harsh, unforgiving glare of fluorescent lights that bleached all color from the world, long queues of weary travelers snaked between retractable barriers, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and anticipation. Every few seconds, the rhythmic, definitive thump of a passport stamp echoed from one of the many booths, a sound that marked the end of one journey and the beginning of another. It was a place of transition, a non-space where status and identity were temporarily reduced to the documents held in one's hand, a great equalizer under the watchful eye of federal law. Into this mundane theater of bureaucracy strode Marcus Sterling, a man who believed himself exempt from such equalization. Dressed in a sharply tailored Italian suit that likely cost more than a year's rent for the average person in line, he was a vibrant slash of wealth against a drab canvas. A gold Rolex gleamed on his wrist as he gestured impatiently, speaking loudly into his latest model smartphone. The Axiom Dynamics merger won't wait for incompetence. He snarled into the device, his voice cutting through the general din and turning heads. He navigated the queue, not by following it, but by piercing through it, his unapologetic stride forcing people to step aside. He didn't see the tired mother pulling her child back or the elderly man he nearly bumped into. He saw only obstacles between himself and his first-class seat to Munich. Observing this disruption from behind the protective glass of his booth was Officer David Miller. A 15-year veteran, Miller was the physical embodiment of calm authority. His uniform was crisp but functional, the fabric showing the subtle signs of long, dedicated service. Unlike Sterling's fiery impatience, Miller's energy was placid, his movements economical and precise. His eyes, however, were anything but still. They absorbed every detail, from the scuff on a traveler's shoe to the nervous tick of a passenger answering a question. Just before Sterling's arrival, Miller had been assisting a family from Colombia, his voice shifting seamlessly into fluent, reassuring Spanish to explain the declaration form. No se preocupe, señora, es un procedimiento estándar, he said with a small, patient smile, his demeanor a quiet testament to a professionalism that went far beyond simply stamping passports. Finally, Sterling reached the counter. He ended his call with a curt snap and, without making eye contact, tossed his navy blue passport onto the steel surface. It slid with a slick, dismissive sound, stopping inches from Miller's hand. Miller paused for a fraction of a second, his own hands resting calmly on the counter, before he deliberately reached out and picked up the document. He opened it, his expression remaining neutral, a carefully constructed mask of professional detachment. Sterling leaned forward, his expensive cologne invading Miller's workspace. "Can we speed this up?" he demanded, his tone low and laced with contempt. "Some of us have economies to run, not just stamps to press." The words were a gauntlet thrown down, a challenge to the quiet dignity of the man in the uniform. If you're ready to see what happens when quiet competence meets loud arrogance, make sure to subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories travel. Officer Miller processed the CEO's initial insult with the same practiced impassivity he applied to a suspicious customs declaration. Outwardly, he was a statue of bureaucratic neutrality, but inwardly, the words landed like tiny, sharp stones. For 15 years, he had stood in this very spot, a gatekeeper between worlds, and had absorbed the anxieties, frustrations, and often the contempt of travelers like Marcus Sterling. He had chosen this life not for a lack of ambition, but because of it. With a master's degree in international relations from Georgetown, he could have been one of the men in expensive suits, but the quiet integrity of public service had called to him, a legacy from his father, a history professor who believed in institutions, and his German mother, who taught him the profound value of order and duty. This sense of duty was a double-edged sword. It compelled him to treat every individual, from a frightened refugee to an arrogant billionaire, with the same procedural respect. It was this code that now demanded he de-escalate, to swallow the personal slight for the sake of professional efficiency. He knew the path of least resistance, asked the basic questions, stamped the passport, and let the poison of Sterling's personality move on to infect some other part of the world. But another part of him, the part that had spent years mastering four languages and memorizing obscure international trade conventions, felt the familiar chafe of being profoundly underestimated. It was a silent internal conflict he navigated daily, the choice between being a functionary and being a guardian. His past was a quiet tapestry of modest choices and deep learning. He didn't live in a sprawling mansion, but a small, neat apartment in Queens, filled with books on history and foreign policy. His most prized possessions weren't luxury cars, but his mother's old German cookbooks and his father's collection of historical maps. He recalled evenings as a child, his mother, Annalise, drilling him on German grammar, her voice a warm and patient melody. "Sprach ist ein Schlüssel, David," she would say. "Language is a key. It unlocks rooms you never knew existed." He never imagined one of those rooms would be a sterile inspection booth at GFK, and the lock would be the hubris of a man who saw him as nothing more than a cog in a machine. The memory of a formal complaint filed against him 5 years prior was a scar on his otherwise spotless record. A diplomat's son, convinced the rules didn't apply to him, had accused Miller of harassment for simply doing his job. The investigation had been stressful and demeaning, a bureaucratic ordeal that had stalled a potential promotion. Though he was eventually exonerated, the lesson was clear. Powerful people had powerful connections, and rocking the boat could have severe consequences. This history was the heavy weight on one side of the scale as he stared at Marcus Sterling's impatient face, a face that was practically daring him to challenge his authority, confident that his status was an impenetrable shield. Miller took a breath, letting it out slowly, and returned his attention to the passport. He began the familiar catechism of his profession, his voice deliberately level and calm, a stark contrast to the CEO's aggressive energy. "What is the purpose of your visit to Germany, Mr. Sterling?" he asked, his eyes scanning the document's photo page. The question was standard, a simple opening to a routine inspection, yet Sterling reacted as if he'd been personally affronted by the inquiry. He scoffed, a short, sharp sound of disbelief that echoed slightly in the enclosed space of the booth. The performance of his indignation was just beginning, and he intended for Miller to be his unwilling audience. "Business." "Obviously," Sterling replied, clipping the words. He tapped a perfectly manicured finger on the gleaming face of his Rolex. "I have a meeting in Munich in less than 12 hours that is critical to the future of my company, Axiom Dynamics. A concept I'm sure is quite foreign to you." The insult was layered, targeting not just Miller's profession, but his intelligence, his entire station in life. Miller's gaze remained fixed on the passport, refusing to give Sterling the satisfaction of a visible reaction. He simply moved to the next question, his adherence to procedure a form of passive resistance against the CEO's escalating hostility. "And what is the nature of the business you are conducting?" Miller continued, his tone unwavering. He was building a record, each question and answer a brick in a wall of professional conduct. Sterling rolled his eyes dramatically. "Are we really doing this? I'm finalizing a multi-billion-dollar technology merger. We're talking about proprietary hardware, the future of data processing. Now, are you going to stamp that passport, or do you need me to draw you a picture?" The volume of his voice was rising, drawing glances from the people behind him in the queue, and even from the officer in the adjacent booth, a younger man who looked at Miller with a mixture of concern and sympathy. It was then that Sterling delivered the line he thought would be his checkmate. Leaning closer to the glass partition, he lowered his voice into a conspiratorial, condescending whisper. "Look, I'll speak slowly for you, okay? I am carrying business samples." He enunciated each word as if speaking to a child. Then, straightening up, he added the final decisive blow. "Tell me, is English your first language? I really need to speak with someone who understands the complexities of international business, not just the simple mechanics of a rubber stamp The air crackled with the sheer audacity of the insult, and a hush fell over the immediate area. A few spots down the line, a woman in her late 20s who had been idly scrolling on her phone now held it different. Her name was Chloe Martinez, a business journalist for an online tech publication, and she had recognized Marcus Sterling the moment he'd started his tirade. At first, she'd been annoyed, but now her journalistic instincts were firing on all cylinders. She discreetly angled her phone, the lens peeking out from behind her purse, and began to record. She understood the implications of this scene better than anyone. A CEO's public behavior could have real-world consequences, especially one from a company like Axiom Dynamics, which was constantly in the news. For Officer Miller, that specific insult, "Is English your first language?" was the key turning the lock inside him. It wasn't just rude. It was a profound miscalculation. It targeted the very core of his bicultural identity, the heritage given to him by his mother. He felt a slow, cold anger crystallize in his chest, but his face remained a mask of serene professionalism. He had made his decision. The de-escalation phase was over. The enforcement phase was about to begin. The risk of a complaint suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the necessity of upholding not just the law, but his own dignity and the integrity of his uniform. He methodically picked up the customs declaration form Sterling had filled out, his eyes moving over the hastily scrawled handwriting. Most travelers filled it out with care, wary of making a mistake. Sterling's was arrogant, the ink strokes sharp and impatient. Miller's eyes landed on box 13, the section for declaring commercial merchandise. Sterling had checked yes, and on the line provided had written 2 words that sealed his fate: proprietary prototypes. It was the technical hook Miller needed, a small detail that a less experienced or less knowledgeable officer might have overlooked. But Miller knew exactly what those words implied under international law. The term proprietary prototypes was a red flag in the world of customs. It suggested technology that was potentially sensitive, possibly subject to export controls, and certainly requiring more documentation than a simple signature on a standard form. Miller's mind, a quiet database of regulations, instantly cross-referenced the phrase with a dozen different treaties and conventions he had studied over the years. He looked up from the paper, his expression unchanged, but a new, steely resolve had settled in his gaze. He was no longer just a customs officer. He was a specialist about to conduct a very precise, very technical operation. "Mr. Sterling," Miller began, his voice still quiet, but now imbued with a new, cutting precision. "Regarding these proprietary prototypes, can you confirm their specific nature?" The question was intentionally vague, designed to test the CEO's knowledge and patience. Sterling, as expected, took the bait. "They're circuit boards. Components. It's technology you wouldn't understand. It's for my company. That's all you need to know." His answer was both dismissive and evasive, another critical error. He was actively obstructing the inspection process, digging his own hole deeper with every arrogant word he uttered. Miller made a small, neat note on a pad next to his computer terminal. Subject evasive regarding nature of goods. He then posed his next question, this one more specific, a scalpel slicing through Sterling's bluster. "Under the terms of the International Technology Transfer Agreement, any device containing encrypted firmware requires a specific export license from the Department of Commerce. Do you have that license with you today?" He knew, with near certainty, that Sterling did not. Men like him rarely bothered with such tedious paperwork, believing their importance was its own form of documentation. Sterling's face, which had been a mask of smug impatience, now flickered with the first hint of genuine confusion, quickly followed by anger. "A license? What are you talking about? They're just samples. This is ridiculous. You're deliberately obstructing my travel. I want to speak to your supervisor." Now he slammed his palm flat on the counter for emphasis, the sound sharp and ugly. The junior officer in the next booth flinched, but Miller remained perfectly still, his calm a silent rebuke to Sterling's tantrum. The power dynamic in their small confrontation was beginning to invert. The journalist, Chloe Martinez, zoomed in slightly with her phone's camera. She recognized the term International Technology Transfer Agreement. This was no longer just a case of a rude CEO. This was a potential international incident in the making. She knew that Axiom Dynamics was rumored to be working on next-generation quantum computing chips, technology that would absolutely be subject to strict export controls. The officer wasn't just being difficult. He was doing his job with a level of expertise that Sterling had clearly not anticipated. Her quick text to her editor was simple and direct. Sterling at GFK, possible export violation. Story getting bigger. Miller ignored the demand for a supervisor. He was the senior officer on this line, and he was well within his authority to conduct this inquiry. His resolve was now absolute, reinforced by the memory of his father's lectures on the rule of law. True power isn't the ability to ignore the rules, his father used to say. It's the understanding of why they exist. For the first time, Miller felt the full weight and strength of that academic wisdom applied in the real world. He was not just a man in a uniform. He was the living embodiment of a principle, and he would not back down. He continued his line of questioning, each query a carefully aimed dart. Have you prepared an auto carnet for the temporary importation of these goods into Germany, sir? He asked, using the official term for the international customs document that would have streamlined this entire process. Of course, Sterling hadn't. The blank, uncomprehending fury on the CEO's face was all the answer Miller needed. Sterling was a man who commanded boardrooms but was utterly lost in the world of actual rules and regulations, a world he had always assumed he could simply buy his way through. A what? A car what? Sterling stammered, his bravado finally cracking. This is insane. I've traveled with prototypes 100 times and never had to deal with this level of bureaucratic nonsense. His complaint was, ironically, an admission of potential past violations, a fact not lost on Miller. The CEO's ignorance, which he had long mistaken for a form of power, was now being exposed as his greatest vulnerability. The trap Miller was laying wasn't malicious. It was procedural, built from the solid, unyielding materials of the law itself. The auto carnet is a standard international customs passport for merchandise, Mr. Sterling. It would exempt you from import duties and taxes and verify the nature of your goods, Miller explained, his tone becoming almost educational, which seemed to infuriate the CEO even more. The calm, lecture-like quality of Miller's voice was a stark contrast to Sterling's sputtering rage. I don't need a lecture from a glorified toll booth operator. My lawyers will handle this. My company's lawyers will own this entire airport by the time I'm done with you. The threats were empty, the desperate roars of a king who had suddenly found himself outside the walls of his castle. All around them, the atmosphere had shifted. The line had stopped moving. The travelers behind Sterling were no longer just annoyed. They were captivated, watching a live drama unfold. The junior officer at the next booth had subtly paused his own work, ostensibly to wait for the system to catch up, but in reality, to witness his veteran colleague dismantle a bully with nothing more than quiet competence and a deep knowledge of the regulations. He was watching a masterclass in how to wield authority without raising one's voice, and he was taking mental notes for his own future. Miller picked up his official stamp, the heavy, ink-laden instrument of his office. He held it for a moment, letting its weight settle in his palm. Sterling's eyes locked onto it, seeing it as the symbol of his potential liberation, the final hurdle before he could be on his way. He visibly relaxed, a smug smile returning to his lips, assuming his threats had finally worked. He believed he had won, that the little man had finally been intimidated into submission. It was a critical misreading of the situation, a failure to understand the man he was dealing with. With a slow, deliberate motion, Miller did not bring the stamp down on the passport. Instead, he placed it carefully back on its ink pad, the soft squish of the rubber meeting the ink the only sound for a moment. He then folded his hands on the counter, a simple gesture that conveyed absolute control. The smile vanished from Sterling's face, replaced by a renewed wave of disbelief and rage. The simple act of not stamping the passport was a more profound act of defiance than any shouted word could ever be. It was a silent declaration that this interaction was now proceeding on Officer Miller's terms, not his. Miller looked past Sterling for a moment, his eyes briefly meeting those of the journalist, Chloe Martinez. He saw the phone, and he understood what was happening. He didn't acknowledge her, but a silent understanding passed between them. The public nature of this confrontation was now a factor, but it didn't change his course of action. It only reinforced the need to be impeccably professional, to ensure that every step he took was perfectly aligned with established procedure. The world, or at least a small part of it, was watching. He then shifted his gaze back to Sterling, and for the first time, he allowed a flicker of something beyond professional neutrality to show in his eyes. It wasn't anger or satisfaction. It was a deep, unshakable confidence, the kind that comes from standing on the firm ground of knowledge and integrity. He was no longer just a customs officer. He was David, and he had just picked up his stones, ready to face Goliath. The CEO, for all his wealth and power, had no idea what was about to hit him. The officer's mind went back to his mother one last time. He remembered her struggling with English when she first arrived in America, the way people would sometimes speak loudly to her, as if volume could bridge the language gap. He remembered the quiet dignity with which she faced their condescension, always responding with politeness and a fierce intelligence they failed to see. He was his mother's son. That thought solidified everything. He was not just defending a regulation. He was honoring the memory of her quiet strength, her resilience in the face of ignorance. He straightened a small stack of declaration forms on his desk, his fingers aligning the edges with perfect precision. It was a small, almost subconscious gesture, a way of centering himself, of bringing order to his immediate environment before he brought order to the situation at hand. It was the final, quiet moment before the storm. Sterling, misinterpreting the silence as hesitation, opened his mouth to unleash another volley of threats and insults, to reassert the dominance he felt slipping away from his grasp. But before Sterling could utter a single word, Miller raised a hand, a simple, universally recognized gesture to wait. The motion was not aggressive, but it was unyieldingly firm. It stopped Sterling cold, his mouth agape. The entire customs hall seemed to hold its breath. The hum of the conveyor belts, the distant announcements, everything faded into the background. All that existed was the charged space between the two men, a space crackling with unspoken tension and the imminent, seismic shift in power that was about to take place. Miller took one final, deep breath. He had laid the groundwork meticulously. He had established a clear record of non-cooperation and potential violations. He had endured the personal abuse with professional restraint. He had identified the precise legal instrument he would use. Every piece was in place. He had given Sterling every opportunity to comply, and Sterling had refused at every turn. Now there was nothing left to do but execute the final move in this complex game of chess. The time for English was over. The officer looked directly into Marcus Sterling's eyes, a connection that was both intimate and adversarial. He saw the blustering rage, the confusion, and the deep-seated arrogance that had led them to this point. He felt no pity, only a profound sense of purpose. He was about to use the key his mother had given him all those years ago. He was about to open a door that Marcus Sterling never even knew existed, a door that led directly out of the CEO's world of privilege and into the unyielding, impartial world of international law. He subtly adjusted his posture, sitting up straighter, his shoulders squared. It was a small physical change, but it broadcasted a major shift in intent. The accommodating public servant was gone, replaced by an implacable enforcer of federal and international statutes. He rested his hands on the counter, his fingers interlaced, a portrait of absolute composure and readiness. The junior officer watched, wide-eyed, knowing he was about to witness something legendary, a story that would be told in break rooms for years to come. The journalist, Chloe, made a final adjustment to her phone's grip, ensuring the audio was clear. She knew this was the turning point. Her heart was pounding, not just with the thrill of a good story, but with a sense of impending justice. She, like everyone else in line, had been subjected to Sterling's second-hand arrogance, and the anticipation of his comeuppance was a palpable force in the air. The stage was perfectly set, the audience was captive, and the main actor was about to deliver a monologue that would bring down the house. Miller allowed the silence to stretch for one more beat, letting Sterling's impatience reach its peak. The CEO was practically vibrating with fury, his face flushed a deep red. He was a bull ready to charge, completely unaware that the matador had no intention of dodging. Instead, the matador was about to reveal that the ground beneath the bull's feet was not solid ground at all, but a carefully disguised trapdoor. The quiet officer from Queens was ready to speak. He cleared his throat, a small formal sound that cut through the tension like a judge's gavel. It was time. He leaned forward slightly, not in a subservient way, but in a way that commanded attention, drawing Sterling into his space. His voice, when it came, was completely transformed. The calm, slightly weary tone of the American public servant was gone, replaced by something else entirely, something crisp, formal, and utterly foreign to Marcus Sterling's ears. The first words out of his mouth were not English. They were perfect, unaccented, formal German. "Herr Sterling," he began, his voice ringing with an authority that Sterling had never heard from him before. The sudden shift in language was so unexpected, so jarring, that it acted like a physical blow. Sterling froze, his mouth hanging open, the angry retort he had been forming dying on his lips. The sheer shock of the moment rendered him speechless, a state he was clearly unaccustomed to. The German words flowed from Miller's mouth with an easy, practiced cadence that spoke of native fluency. He was no longer just Officer Miller. He was a man wielding a hidden weapon with surgical precision. The other travelers, a mix of nationalities, looked on in stunned silence. Some who understood German had looks of dawning comprehension and amusement on their faces. Others simply stared, recognizing the dramatic weight of the moment, even if they didn't understand the words being spoken. Miller continued in German, explaining the legal predicament Sterling had created for himself. He spoke about the conventions governing the transport of proprietary technology, the necessity for proper documentation, and the serious penalties for non-compliance. His tone was not angry or mocking. It was the detached, informative tone of an expert explaining a complex but immutable fact to a layman. He was systematically dismantling Sterling's world, using a language the CEO had intended to use for his billion-dollar deal, but was now being used against him. He cited specific articles and subsections of international accords, numbers and clauses that sounded official and unbreakable. The German language, with its precise and authoritative sounds, was the perfect vehicle for this display of competence. It was the language of engineering, of philosophy, of regulations, and in this moment, it was the language of Miller's complete and total control over the situation. Sterling could only stare, his mind struggling to process the sudden and absolute reversal of their roles. The junior officer at the neighboring booth could not suppress a slow grin from spreading across his face. He had always respected Miller, but this was a revelation. He was witnessing the quiet, unassuming veteran he worked with every day transform into an international legal powerhouse right before his eyes. It was a powerful lesson that true authority didn't come from a fancy title or a loud voice, but from the quiet, diligent acquisition of knowledge. Chloe Martinez's finger trembled slightly as she held her phone. This was gold. This was the viral moment, the clip that would be shared and replayed millions of times. It was a story of hubris and comeuppance, of the little guy standing up to the bully in the most unexpected and intelligent way possible. She was no longer just a journalist covering a story. She was a witness to an act of beautiful, professional vengeance that would resonate with working people everywhere. Miller paused, letting his German words hang in the air and their impact settle. He had laid out the legal framework, established the violation, and demonstrated his superior knowledge. He had used his hidden skill, not as a party trick, but as a tool of his trade, a key to unlock a room of law and order that Sterling had tried to force his way through. Now, it was time for the final, finishing touch, the translation, the golden line that would be remembered long after the details faded. He switched back to English, his voice still holding the new, sharp edge of authority. He looked Sterling directly in the eye, a glint of cold fire in his gaze. He wanted to make sure the CEO, and everyone else listening, understood exactly what had just happened. He was about to translate not just his words, but the entire moral of this impromptu play they had just performed for the entire customs hall. "What I just explained to you in German, Mr. Sterling," he said, his voice now carrying across the quiet hall, "is that your failure to declare these prototypes properly puts you in violation of the Bern-Munich Convention on the Transport of Proprietary Technology, specifically Article 7, which requires a full technical manifest and proof of origin, which you have failed to provide." He delivered the explanation with the cold, hard finality of a closing argument. He let that sink in for a moment before delivering the final, devastating blow. He leaned forward one last time, his voice dropping to a conversational but intensely clear level, ensuring every word was heard by the people nearby and, most importantly, by the journalist's recording device. It was the line that would encapsulate the entire encounter, the phrase that would go viral and define the moment for posterity. "Let me be perfectly clear, sir," Officer Miller said, his gaze unwavering. "Your journey to Munich is currently suspended pending a full secondary inspection of your person and property, an inspection which, I can assure you, will be exceptionally thorough." He picked up Sterling's passport, no longer a symbol of privilege, but a piece of evidence, and placed it neatly to the side, under his complete control. The physical act was a clear signal. The gate was now closed. He saw the flicker of comprehension and then sheer, sputtering panic in Sterling's eyes. The CEO finally understood the gravity of his miscalculation. He wasn't just being delayed. His entire trip, his multi-billion-dollar deal, was now in serious jeopardy. He had picked a fight with a man he assumed was a nobody and had discovered far too late that this nobody held all the cards, understood all the rules, and was not afraid to play his winning hand. The surrounding travelers were now openly smiling. A few even exchanged quiet, satisfied glances. It was a moment of collective catharsis, a shared victory for every person who had ever been talked down to, dismissed, or bullied by someone who believed their wealth made them superior. They had just witnessed a public servant, armed with nothing but his intellect and his integrity, expertly and surgically dismantle an arrogant titan of industry. Miller made a brief, formal notation in his computer system, his fingers moving calmly across the keyboard. Referral to secondary. Suspected violation of international transport conventions. Subject uncooperative. Every action was by the book, creating an impenetrable fortress of procedure around his decision. He knew a complaint was still coming, but now he had an ironclad defense, one that would be supported by witnesses, and, unbeknownst to him, a viral video. He then pressed a small button on his console, and within moments, two other CBP officers, larger and more imposing, arrived at his booth. They stood on either side of a stunned and suddenly very small-looking Marcus Sterling. Their presence was calm, but non-negotiable. There would be no more arguing, no more threats. The time for discussion was officially over. The lead officer of the pair spoke, his voice polite but firm. "Mr. Sterling, if you'll please come with us." It was not a request. Marcus Sterling, the CEO, the master of the universe, was being escorted away like a common criminal, his face a mottled canvas of fury, humiliation, and disbelief. He was speechless, finally and completely silenced. As they led him away towards the frosted glass doors of the secondary inspection area, Miller allowed himself a single, fleeting moment of satisfaction. It wasn't triumph or revenge. It was the quiet, profound satisfaction of a job done right, of order restored, and of a deeply ingrained principle being proven true, that character, competence, and a respect for the rules will always, in the end, outweigh arrogance and entitlement. The scales of justice, at least in this small corner of the world, had been balanced. The abrupt shift to flawless German landed in the sterile airport hall with the force of a physical shockwave, creating a pocket of absolute silence round Miller's booth. Marcus Sterling, who had been puffing up his chest for another verbal assault, froze mid-breath, his expression a comical mask of bewilderment. The aggressive, forward-leaning posture he had held for the last 10 minutes slackened, his shoulders slumping as his brain struggled to process the auditory anomaly. It was a moment of pure cognitive dissonance. The low-level bureaucrat he had dismissed as barely competent was now speaking the language of his crucial business deal with a fluency that Sterling himself, for all his international travel, could not match. The foundation of his superiority, his perceived intellectual and cultural dominance, crumbled into dust in an instant. The onlookers who had been a passive audience were now active participants in the stunned silence. A German couple standing a few places back in the queue exchanged wide-eyed, incredulous looks, a shared smile of national pride and schadenfreude blooming on their faces. They understood every crisp, authoritative word Miller spoke, recognizing the formal, educated dialect he was using. Others who didn't speak the language understood the power play on a more primal level. They could hear the confidence, the precision, and the undeniable authority in Miller's tone, and they saw its devastating effect on the loud American CEO. It was a universal language of a power dynamic being spectacularly inverted. Sterling's mind raced, trying to find a foothold in the new, surreal landscape of this confrontation. He searched Miller's face for any sign of a joke, a trick, a linguistic fluke, but found none. He saw only a calm, unwavering professionalism that was now, somehow, 10 times more intimidating than before. The officer hadn't raised his voice or changed his expression, yet he had completely altered the reality of their interaction. Sterling felt the eyes of everyone in the queue on him, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt small, exposed, and profoundly, hopelessly outmaneuvered. The hunter had not just been caught in a trap. He had discovered the trap was a cage he had built himself. In that moment of stunned silence, Miller held all the power. He was no longer a faceless government employee. He was a multilingual specialist, a guardian of international law, whose hidden depth Sterling had catastrophically failed to gauge. The CEO's most potent weapon, his condescension, had been rendered useless because its premise was false. He had tried to belittle a man for his supposed lack of sophistication, only to have that same man reveal a level of erudition that dwarfed his own. Miller let the silence linger, a tactical pause to allow the full weight of Sterling's miscalculation to crush him before proceeding to the final checkmate. Having laid the legal groundwork in German, Miller switched back to English, his voice remaining sharp and clear, ensuring everyone could understand the verdict. "To be clear, Mr. Sterling," he began, his tone that of a professor correcting a particularly arrogant student, "your aggressive refusal to answer standard questions, combined with the sensitive nature of the goods you've declared, gives me more than sufficient cause to believe you are not in compliance with the Bern-Munich Convention. This is a serious matter." He was no longer asking questions. He was delivering a judgment backed by the full, impersonal weight of international treaty law. It was a wall of logic and regulation against which Sterling's blustering had no effect. Then he leaned forward just enough to make the statement feel personal, a direct strike against the man's character. He delivered the line that would echo long after the confrontation was over, the one Chloe Martinez knew would be the headline of her story. "Mr. Sterling, your English is impeccable," Miller said, his voice even and devoid of sarcasm, which made the words cut even deeper. He paused for a beat, letting the compliment land before twisting the knife. "Your manners, however, require an international review." The sentence was a masterpiece of professional demolition, dismantling Sterling's ego with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. The impact of the line was immediate and devastating. It wasn't a curse or a common insult. It was an intellectual condemnation. It reframed Sterling not as a powerful executive, but as an ill-behaved child, a boor whose behavior was so poor it necessitated a formal inquiry. A few audible gasps rippled through the line, followed by a quickly suppressed chuckle from the German tourist. Sterling flinched as if he'd been physically struck. His wealth, his title, his expensive suit, none of it could protect him from the simple, crushing truth of that statement. In the court of public opinion, and in the official context of this inspection, his character had just been declared fundamentally deficient. The journalist captured the moment, her phone perfectly steady. She saw the story's climax unfolding in brilliant clarity, the quiet hero, the arrogant villain, and the perfect, unforgettable line that encapsulated the entire conflict. This was more than just an airport argument. It was a modern fable about the difference between status and dignity. It was a testament to the idea that true authority is not inherited or bought, but earned through knowledge, patience, and an unwavering commitment to one's principles. She knew with absolute certainty that this footage would resonate with millions of people who felt unseen and undervalued in their own jobs. Finally, Marcus Sterling found his voice, but the booming, commanding baritone was gone, replaced by a weak, sputtering stammer. You can't do this," he managed, his eyes darting around as if seeking an ally in the crowd of unsympathetic faces. He fell back on the last resort of the defeated bully, the pathetic appeal to his own hollow importance. "Do you have any idea who I am?" The question, which he had used his entire life as a key to unlock doors and bypass rules, now sounded desperate and meaningless. It was the empty bleat of a king who had just been dethroned. This was the moment of Miller's true transformation. He didn't gloat. He didn't reply with a sarcastic, "No who." Instead, he answered with the calm, profound philosophy that had guided his entire career, now finally spoken aloud. "Sir," he said, his voice firm but not unkind, "I know exactly who you are. You are the name on this passport. You are a traveler subject to the laws of this country and the international agreements it upholds." He held up the passport slightly, not as a threat, but as an exhibit of a fundamental truth Sterling had forgotten. "These regulations," Miller continued, his voice resonating with a conviction that came from 15 years of service, "are not here to inconvenience you. They are here to create a fair and orderly process for everyone. They protect the student traveling abroad for the first time, just as they protect the CEO on his way to a merger. They are the barrier between order and chaos." He was no longer just an officer. He was a teacher, explaining the foundational principles of a civilized world to a man who had long believed himself to be above them. He was defending the very system Sterling had so arrogantly disdained. In that speech, short as it was, Miller defined himself and his purpose. He had absorbed the contempt and condescension, not out of weakness, but out of a deep-seated strength and belief in his role. By refusing to make it personal, he had made it universal. He was standing up not just for himself, but for every public servant, for every quiet professional who does their job with integrity in the face of disrespect. He had turned a moment of personal humiliation into a powerful defense of the rule of law, and in doing so, had found his own voice. Having delivered his final word on the matter, Miller calmly pressed a button on his console. The action was small, but its implication was huge. He was officially escalating the situation beyond his own booth, formally handing Sterling over to the next stage of the process. He then took the CEO's passport and the offending declaration form and placed them together in a clear plastic folder, a procedural act that symbolized the closing of this chapter and the beginning of Sterling's administrative ordeal. The CEO watched the simple movements, his face pale, finally understanding the irreversible nature of what was happening. Within seconds, 2 more CBP officers appeared at Miller's side. They were larger than him, their presence conveying a quiet, no-nonsense authority. They didn't look at Miller. They looked at Sterling, their expressions neutral but unyielding. Their arrival signaled the end of the debate. The time for words was over. The time for compliance had begun. Sterling, who was used to giving orders, was now in the terrifying position of having to take them, and his entire body language screamed his resistance and fear. "You'll regret this. I'll have your job." Sterling snarled, a final, reflexive burst of his old self. But the threat was hollow, stripped of all its power. It was the desperate cry of a man who had lost and knew it. The 2 officers ignored him completely. One of them spoke, his voice polite, but edged with steel. "Sir, you need to come with us now. Please collect your briefcase." The word, "please," was a formality, not an option. Sterling was no longer in charge of his own movement, let alone the fate of a customs officer. As the officers escorted a now silent Marcus Sterling toward the frosted glass doors of the secondary inspection area, a place from which travelers rarely emerged quickly, a strange calm settled back over the customs hall. The drama was over. Miller watched them go for only a second, his face betraying no emotion, before he turned his attention back to his station. The great titan of industry was gone, and the quiet officer remained. He took a single, cleansing breath, squared the ink pad on his desk, and looked to the front of the now gaping queue. He met the eyes of the next traveler, an elderly woman with a kind, wrinkled face, and gave her a small, genuine smile. "Next in line, please," he said, his voice returning to its usual gentle cadence. The storm had passed. As Marcus Sterling disappeared behind the frosted glass doors, a tangible sense of relief washed over the customs hall, as if the collective atmospheric pressure had dropped. Officer Miller felt the tension drain from his own shoulders, a weight he hadn't fully realized he was carrying. He did not feel a rush of victory or a surge of pride. Instead, there was a quiet, profound sense of equilibrium, the feeling of a world set right. He had faced down the ugly, chaotic force of unchecked arrogance and had restored order through knowledge and restraint. It was the core principle of his professional life, and he had proven its strength not only to a bully, but to himself. The internal conflict that had simmered within him for years had finally been resolved. He gestured again to the elderly woman at the front of the line, his smile warm and genuine. "My apologies for the delay, ma'am," he said, his voice softening completely, the hard edge of authority dissolving as if it had never been there. The woman, who had watched the entire exchange with wide, fascinated eyes, beamed at him. "No apology necessary, young man," she replied, her voice frail but firm. "That was better than any movie I've seen in years." Miller felt a slight blush rise on his neck as he took her passport. He processed her entry with gentle efficiency, asking about her visit to see her grandchildren, his demeanor a living testament to his belief that respect is a courtesy owed to all, not a tribute paid to power. Meanwhile, Chloe Martinez had found a relatively quiet spot near a departure gate, her fingers flying across her phone screen. The video was uploading. She crafted a caption that was both informative and incendiary. "Live from GFK, Axiom Dynamics CEO Marcus Sterling learns a brutal lesson in international law and basic human decency from a CBP officer who speaks better German than he does. Hubris meets its match." She added relevant hashtags: Axiom Dynamics, hashtag CEO, hashtag JFK, hashtag Karma, and the one she knew would catch on, hashtag International Review. She hit post, and the digital flare was launched into the vast, hungry sky of the internet. Within minutes, the views started to climb, first by the hundreds, then the thousands, as her followers shared it with explosive speed. By the time Sterling was finally released from a grueling 4-hour secondary inspection, his prototypes confiscated pending a full review by the Department of Commerce, the video had been viewed over 1 million times. He had missed his flight. His frantic calls to his contacts in Munich were met with icy professionalism. The German executives had also seen the video. His billion-dollar merger was not just in jeopardy, it was evaporating before his eyes. The board of directors at Axiom Dynamics had been alerted by a horrified communications team, and an emergency virtual meeting was already underway. The primary agenda item was not the deal in Munich, but the catastrophic liability their own CEO had become. The fallout was swift and brutal. The board, facing a public relations nightmare and shareholder revolt, issued a public apology for Mr. Sterling's unacceptable behavior, which they stated did not reflect the values of Axiom Dynamics. Sterling was placed on an immediate, indefinite leave of absence, a corporate euphemism for a slow and painful firing. His career, built on a foundation of aggressive intimidation and a carefully cultivated image of untouchable power, had been irrevocably shattered by a 10-minute encounter he had initiated and a viral video he never saw coming. He had flown too close to the sun, and his wings of arrogance had melted away completely. The next day, Officer Miller was called into his supervisor's office. He walked in with a sense of calm resignation, expecting to see a formal complaint from Sterling's high-priced lawyers on the desk. He was prepared to defend his actions, armed with his incident report and the knowledge that he had acted entirely within protocol. To his surprise, his supervisor, a stern man named Chief Inspector Davies, was smiling. "Miller," Davies began, gesturing for him to sit down. "I've had the port director on the phone all morning. So has the assistant commissioner from D.C. On his desk was not a complaint, but a printout of a commendation letter. We reviewed your report and the security footage. Not to mention the video the entire world seems to be watching," Davies continued, his smile widening. "Your handling of the situation was, and I quote the commissioner, a masterclass in professionalism and de-escalation through superior knowledge. You upheld the integrity of this agency and the laws we enforce under extreme personal provocation." He pushed the commendation letter across the desk. "This will be placed in your permanent file. You've made us all proud, David." The use of his first name was the highest praise of all, a sign of deep, personal respect from a man not known for offering it lightly. Months passed, and the story of the quiet customs officer became a piece of modern folklore. For Marcus Sterling, the international review of his manners had resulted in a forced retirement and a reputation he would never escape. For David Miller, however, the incident became a catalyst for unexpected change. His deep knowledge of international protocols, once a hidden asset, was now widely recognized. He received an offer that stunned him, a promotion to a newly created position at the CBP National Training Center. His new role would be to develop and lead a specialized curriculum for officers interacting with high-stakes international travelers. He accepted the position. His new job was to be a liaison for diplomatic and corporate travel protocols, teaching a new generation of officers how to combine procedural rigor with cultural and linguistic skills. He used the video of the Sterling incident as a core part of his training module, not to shame the former CEO, but as a case study in how to identify and dismantle arrogance using the tools of the law. He taught that the uniform's true power came not from the authority it projected, but from the integrity of the person wearing it, a lesson he had learned from his parents and forged in the crucible of his own experience. In the end, Officer Miller's life was transformed not by a single act of defiance, but by a lifetime of quiet, diligent preparation meeting its perfect moment. He had never sought the spotlight, but it had found him, illuminating the profound truth that real strength isn't loud, it's knowledgeable. It doesn't demand respect, it earns it. His story became an inspiration, a reminder that in any confrontation, the person with the deepest understanding and the strongest character will ultimately prevail. He continued to be a guardian at the gate, only now the gate he protected was the one that ensured professionalism and dignity would be the standard for all. Officer Miller used his knowledge and dignity as his shield. What do you think is more powerful, wealth or character? Leave a little heart if you believe integrity is the ultimate authority. Subscribe for more stories where the right thing wins the day. Comment knowledge is power if you believe in the strength of quiet competence.